Chapter 8: The Present Economic Crisis in the USSR. In the West, a crisis manifests itself in an obvious decline in the total of goods and services produced. Crisis in the USSR has not taken the form of an actual decline in production until recently. Rather, crisis has existed in the form of an apparent growth in total production despite intractable problems in the economy. The similarity between the two systems is that both involve pressure on the standard of living, the waste of large quantities of goods, and above all, and this is what makes it a crisis, a need to reestablish a social relationship of control. In the Soviet context, all internal and external observers agree on the steadily declining growth rates, a relatively low and recently declining expectation of life, a rise in alcoholism, and a relatively static or declining standard of living for many, particularly in relation to food. On the question of the standard of living in the USSR, Leonid Gordon is quite explicit that the standard of living is below that expected by the population. Footnote: see L.A. Gordon, Something in Russian, 1987. However, unlike the situation in a Western Depression, this goes along with greater production than ever. Gorbachev pointed out in his 11th of June 1985 speech that the USSR produces more steel than anyone else, but that this steel is of poor quality and goes to waste, that the USSR continues to build ever more factories rather than re-equipping old factories, that the factories take forever to build and that their completion is unpredictable. Footnote: see something by M. Krushinsky, 1988. Krushinsky deals with the whole question. Wrong footnote. Footnote: Pravda, 11th of June, 1985. There are similar reports about cement. The USSR produces more cement than anyone else, but the USSR both has a shortage of cement and does not supply the housing needs of the population. Footnote: here we are. Krushinsky, Izvestia, 14th of July, 1988. Krushinsky deals with the whole question of housing and points out, among other things, that piles of cement are hoarded by enterprises, that buildings are constructed that are unnecessary, and that priority is given to projects that have greater total plan results. In this case, the ministry and enterprise might prefer a dam to house construction. End footnote. The trebling of investment in housing from 1960 to 1986 has only led to a decline in the actual number of houses constructed. Footnote: Ekonomicheskaya Gazeta, June 1985, Pravda, 1st of October 1987, carries the statement of the Central Committee promising an individual flat to every family unit by the year 2000. The statement admits that there is a severe housing shortage and criticizes existing corruption in allocation. The actual number of flats constructed reached a peak of 2.6 million in 1960, but was down to 2.1 million in 1986 and not quite 2 million in 1985. It has to be said that the size of the flats has increased over this period. Nonetheless, capital investment in residential construction has trebled in the period from 1960 to 1986, from 10.8 billion rubles to 30.9 billion rubles, with inflation officially taken into account. End footnote. Brezhnev complained in 1976 about 700 million shoes produced, and yet they had a shortage of shoes. 8 years later, Chernenko got around to having a decree on shoes. Footnote: Pravda, 22nd of February, 1985. End footnote. That even the Politburo had to have a special discussion on shoes is itself instructive. Now, Agamben is discussing the problem of shoes also. Footnote: Izvestia, 25th of August, 1987. End footnote. Too much produced, too little output for the consumer is the endemic problem of the USSR. Although the USSR could not always boast the first place in the world in machine tools, steel, cement, etc. One Soviet writer described the economy as follows, quote, "In life, unfortunately, there is something else, an economy torn by the sharpest contradictions, with its horrifying waste, colossal inefficiency, and total lack of direction in relation to its development." End quote. Footnote. Some article from 1989. This article is an argument for the economic independence of Latvia. The author points out, in the context of the above quote, that the grounds for maintaining the economic integrity of the USSR are greatly weakened by the failure of the economy. He then cites the example of two adjacent factories in Kaunas, the one supplying the inputs needed by the other, instead to factories in the Urals, the Caucasus, and the South. There is, he argues, no unified plan, only a mess. End footnote. What then is the meaning of growth with such a low final output? What kind of growth is it that leads to increasing shortages of industrial goods? Can one call it growth at all? The USSR is not like an underdeveloped country, and that the USSR does have a developed industrial base, and its industrial production in total quantity compares with that of a developed Western country. Soviet waste, however, is not the same as the waste of a capitalist country. The problem is not one of unemployed workers or resources, as in the West, but one of goods that are of low quality, the use of outdated technique, and the employment of vast numbers of people, and the huge quantities of raw materials to achieve results that are a fraction of what either planned or attained in the West. Long ago, the time of the first 5-year plan, Christian Rakovsky discussed these problems of the Soviet economy as follows, quote, "A rail is a rail, and if, let us say, the rail's formal production costs go down by several percent, this does not mean that the economy is benefited by this same amount. The fact that this rail looks outwardly just like a pre-war rail deceives no one, for this rail eliminates the fact that our contemporary rail lasts not even 5 years, while a pre-war rail lasted 40. And this is happening not only with rails. Whole factories are being erected out of defective construction materials and equipped with machines made from defective metal. Today's decline in production costs will turn into tomorrow's ... colossal losses for the national economy." Footnote. Christian Rakovsky, The 5-Year Plan in Crisis, published in Critique 13. End footnote. Since then, the same question has become the basis of any understanding of growth in the USSR. The crisis in the USSR is manifested in the need to establish a new form of social control. But put differently, the elite find that the elite can no longer manage the society in the old way. Its immediate and general and phenomenal form has been one of declining growth rates, under conditions where growth has always been contradictory. In a certain sense, the USSR has always been a country of crisis. Shortages of food and consumer goods have been endemic. In fact, it is quite possible to interpret the history of the USSR as one of lurching from one crisis to another. After all, the new economic policy failed under Bukharin and Stalin and was replaced by the disastrous period of collectivization, overaccumulation, famine, and plunging living standards in the towns. In the post-war period, agriculture remained the Achilles heel of the economy, while industry remained locked into production for production's own sake. The interpretation of the USSR as a regime of permanent crisis is common, and is not without validity. Clearly, the problem with such a view in the USSR is now in a new kind of crisis, that the USSR is now in a new kind of crisis from which it cannot emerge in the same form as it has existed for the last 60 years. In short, the word crisis can be overused. The rationale behind the view that the USSR is in permanent crisis lies in its expression of constant conflict among social forces in the USSR. This has taken such forms as the attack on the peasantry, the purges, anti-Semitism, and indeed an overall chauvinism that is now reaping a harvest of national disintegration. It has involved an atomization of the working class, which was suppressed, if necessary, with direct force. In economic terms, the crisis showed itself in the antagonism between the ruble and goods, or, in other words, in permanent shortages and the absence of money, and in the consistent inability of the center to achieve the center's goals or plans. Enormous levels of obvious waste and transparent inefficiency have always characterized the regime, and it has moved from one form of economic control to another in order to raise levels of productivity. Yet whatever the lurches of the regime has until recently succeeded in industrializing and urbanizing the economy. If the standard of living is low, it is still considerably higher than it was under the Tsarist regime. What it might have been under another system is another question, because the issue under discussion here is not whether the USSR is undergoing a crisis at the present time. Clearly, if there has always been a crisis, then the present crisis is simply a natural aspect of the regime itself. This book argues, however, that the regime has functioned in the regime's own way, but has now reached a natural end. It appears to be in a permanent crisis because it has no long-term future, and because it functions at a higher level of contradiction, or, as the above quote shows, through the sharpest contradictions. Footnote. See the discussion of contradiction in Chapter 1. The point is that the USSR is both in permanent crisis and in a terminal crisis. But a system in permanent crisis is a system of permanent crisis. And hence interest centers on the form of the system itself and the system's decline. In other words, the word, quote, crisis provides an insufficient description of a system that exists over a long period of time with its own mode of existence. The central issues that have to be addressed are the nature of growth, the reasons for that growth, and that growth's ending, and the relationship of the social structure to that growth. The solutions provided here are both simple and complex. The economy did grow, but in a very special form, which, because of its form, could only continue for a limited time. The terminal crisis of the present time is then inherited in the form of growth. To understand the special form of growth, we have to start from the nature of production itself, and so the nature of the Soviet product. Just as under capitalism, the fundamental contradiction of the system lies in the opposition of exchange value and use value, or in the opposition of human needs and the form in which they are satisfied. So in the USSR, the contradiction must lie in the form of the satisfaction of human needs. New section, the law of value and its absence in the USSR. What the USSR clearly does not have is a market economy. At a superficial level, it is obvious that a regime intent on moving to the market cannot have a market, but some people may object that they do have black markets, ruble, sale and purchase, etc. Clearly they do, but capital goods cannot be bought and sold, and land cannot be bought and sold, and the transport system, construction and housing for the individual are all virtually allocated or so heavily subsidized as to make all talk of purchase and sale a mockery. Soviet economists, as we have seen, do not see a labor market in existence either. Bogomolov, indeed, talked of semi-forced labor. Footnote. Something in Russian. Press conference given by Popov, Bogomolov, Tissichkin, Abalkin, and Tikhonov. End footnote. If there is neither a labor market nor a capital market, and many consumer goods are directly allocated or subsidized, while the rest are obtainable largely through a rationing system, exchange value has been wiped out. There is a distinction to be made between the existence of the law of value and the existence of exchange value. In principle, there could be exchange value without value. Thus, the black market has exchange value without value because there is no basis on which to establish costs. In the USSR, the decay of the quote planning mechanism has meant the growth of so-called markets, but they are obviously not based on cost so much as on what the seller can gouge out of the buyer. From this point of view of orthodox economics, there is no difference between this kind of parasitic market and one based on a regular supply system, except for the absence of competition. Yet from the point of view of either Marxist economics or the perception of the Soviet person in the street, there is a considerable difference. Production in the USSR in the main proceeds through the system of bureaucratic organization, and goods are essentially allocated to outlets. The final customer obtains goods through a modified rationing system. For the few who have foreign currency or large quantities of rubles in the right contacts, there has been opportunity to purchase goods at a price that reflects only risk and scarcity. With the Gorbachev reforms and the introduction of the cooperative movement, there is a legal market for those who have the rubles, but in the absence of competition and with the shortage of supplies, which have to be either especially allocated by the quote planning system or obtained by semi-legal means, production or the supply of services in this quote market sector takes on a hybrid form. If there is no value and thus no money in the USSR, the nature of the contradiction in the USSR has to be sought outside of value itself. Indeed, it has to be sought in the nature of the Soviet product. A product that is of low quality does not serve the purpose intended, and is technologically backward as a product, but it is defective as a product. If it is unreliable in operation, the matter is still worse. Yet these features are normally present in the Soviet product, either singly or in combination. If a pair of trousers is produced, those trousers can be made with one leg somewhat longer than the other. It can be worn, even though it may be regarded as somewhat inelegant. If trousers were all of one size, most people could find a way of wearing them, even if they looked odd. The trousers thus continue to have a use value, but their real use value is quite different from the imagined or intended use value. In other words, the contradiction lies between the imagined nature of the product and the product's actual nature. Put differently, the contradiction lies between the bureaucratic or organized nature of the product and its real form. This difference between the apparent form and the real form is at the heart of Soviet reality. Technically, the USSR is, quote, planned, but in reality the so-called plans are arrived at by a bargaining procedure between the relevant institutions. The targets are adjusted over time. In the next section, we will go into more detail on the defective nature of Soviet use values. New section. The nature of the contradiction within the product. Value represents a particular mode of social organization of production, distribution, and exchange. Value's alternative in the USSR is direct organization of those features of the economy. Such organization could be planned or administered. In the USSR, it is administered. The contradiction within the product is then between the administered form of the product and the product's use value. The additional complication is that the contradiction leads to another level of contradiction. The use value produced is defective, and so a contradiction is established between the potential use value and its real use value. To cite one statistic, on the 1st of October 1987, in a climate of general shortage, one author provides as evidence of poor quality the fact that, quote, unmarketable and old stock came to 1,439,000,000,000 rubles, end quote. Since this is only goods that are unsaleable, it is just a small indication of the larger problem. In the context of the USSR, the term, quote, defective use value means a good that is not what that good appears to be. A jacket is a jacket, but a jacket with one arm shorter than the other arm may or may not be said to be a jacket. A machine tool that breaks down frequently may be considered to be an occasional machine tool. A contradiction exists between the machine tool's ostensible function and the machine tool's actual operation. The contradiction in production and circulation is between the form in which production is organized and the use value itself. It results then in the alienation to the consumer of a product that, uniquely in world history, has a contradictory use value. The waste in the USSR then emerges as the difference between what the product promises and what the product is. The difference between the appearance of planning and socialism and the reality of a harsh bureaucratized administration shows itself in the product itself. Marx points out in Capital that whether the use value is imaginary or real does not alter the fact that the product is a use value. For purposes of purchase, it makes no difference, but in use it does make a difference. In a capitalist society, the crucial question is exchange value, and hence the real operation of the product can be secondary. If the Japanese managed before the Second World War to sell watches without insides and pencils without lead in the middle, they would nonetheless have accumulated capital with which to make high-quality watches and other items. In principle, if the economy had a whole series of plants that operated poorly, but the products were bought by other plants that also operated poorly, the accumulation process could proceed without hindrance. In practice, if the use value does not live up to specification, further similar products will not be bought, and hence a plant that used inadequate machine tools might find its profits reduced. On the other hand, it is quite possible to imagine a section of industry, like the military industry, where use value efficiency and the product actually mean little in the absence of the real possibility of war. In fact, under capitalism, the shoddy goods are bought by the workers and the unemployed in particular. Indeed, firms like IBM see to it that their products are so differentiated that the out-of-date and less reliable models are designated for the less fortunate. In the USSR, on the contrary, all goods are saleable, and to this day, the promised Gorbachev reforms notwithstanding, profits in fact mean little. It is the use value that counts both in operation and in appearance. As a result, the enterprise has to consider both aspects of the use value's apparent use and the use value's real use. In producing the good, the superficial specifications are what count. Too much emphasis on quality can only lead to an increase in cost and a decline in the total produced. But in obtaining a product from another enterprise, it will be the real utility of the good that will count. The contradiction in the product therefore sets up an antagonistic relation between producer and consumer enterprises. It also establishes a conflict between the worker as consumer and the elite as a controller of enterprises. At one level, it appears as if the worker stands opposed to himself, in that his two sides as producer and consumer conflict. This is only true superficially. The worker as consumer is an individual responsible to himself, whereas the worker as producer is responsible and directly under the control of the factory manager and so of the controlling elite. Two sides of use value, parenthesis, use values imagined or intended use on the one hand and its use in operation on the other, and parenthesis, the two sides of use value, parenthesis, use values imagined or intended use on the one hand and use values use in operation on the other, end parenthesis, are in contradiction with each other. If the term, quote, contradiction is used in the sense of an interpenetration of opposites, then it is of interest to note the development of that contradiction. On the side of the producers, two solutions are provided. In order to compensate for the low quality, more and more has to be produced. Replacements, new products, and spare parts do compensate to a limited degree for the defective product. The society also forces the producers to raise the quality of production. The enterprises, in turn, are compelled to demand more resources to achieve that object, which leads to an increase in costs of the product. Both solutions lead to a greater industrialization, and so socialization of production, which because of its greater integration actually leads to the potential, or even worse, of an even worse product when any link in the chain breaks down. For instance, some years ago, the then Soviet Prime Minister pointed out that irrigation canals had been built in an area of southern Russia that was then flooded accidentally with sea water. The agriculture of that area was obviously ruined. If a crucial machine tool breaks down, the whole factory or a whole sector might be held up. The usual alternative to no product at all is an inferior product. The wheat irradiated by the Chernobyl disaster ought to have been discarded, but it is quite clear from Soviet statistics that it is being used. The crucial machine tool can be replaced by a machine tool that fails to do the job properly. The dynamic of the contradiction is a process of growth and is ever more precarious. In principle, one could imagine a society that had apparently enormous rates of growth, but produced no worthwhile final product at all. Since this is impossible, the real logic of the regime is one of cycles in which very rapid growth alternates with periods of little or no growth. The periods of little or no growth occurs when the paradox of over-industrialization confronts its own underdeveloped nature. This occurs in two ways. The sectoral division becomes progressively more out of line with demand, and the system exhausts its sources of labor over time. The natural logic of this system would be one in which all enterprises were crippled through lack of resources, unless the central planners called a halt and introduced measures to reorder the sectors and stop the growth of particularly resource-absorbing parts of the economy. Looked at another way, the system has a natural tendency toward anarchy and chaos, unless the center establishes maximum control. The paradox, of course, is that it is in fact the over-centralized nature of the economy, or the bureaucratized nature of the product, that causes the chaos in the first place. Since the center attempts to administer everything, and it necessarily lacks both the apparatus and the knowledge to do so, the individual plant is forced to find its own individual method of coping with the so-called plans. The plans, in fact, have the same contradictions as the product in that they are a unity of the imagined and real. The plan itself is imagined, but its imposition does have the effect of organizing the system and preventing chaos. The contradiction between the imaginary product and the real product, then, is fundamental to the system in the USSR. All categories are subject to it, in the same way that the contradiction between use value and exchange value governs capitalism. At the same time, this contradiction only arises on the basis of a prior contradiction between an administered form of the product and use value. New section. Consequences of the defective product. The administered form of the product is one in which the life cycle of the product is governed by direct command rather than spontaneity, based either on value or on democratically agreed and internalized rules. The administration of use value is necessarily contradictory for the reason given above. There is no way that a center of any kind can have either the knowledge of the nature of use values or the means of implementation of decisions over use values that correspond to real situations. The direct producer must have a degree of autonomy to produce a good that conforms to needs. The direct producer must also have an incentive to do so. Direct instruction does not provide such an incentive unless accompanied by a democratic process of decision making. Put differently, behind the administered product form lies a form of control over labor. Labor power as a product has the same form as other products in that it performs below specifications. The imagined performance of labor power is one thing, its actual utility is another. The result, however, is that labor negates the category of abstract labor and becomes organized labor. As organized labor, the worker stands in contradiction to himself as concrete laborer. He works at his own rate with a measure of control over his work process, so establishing an individuality for himself and his work process. In turn, his product becomes individual and so different from other products. Administrative logic dictates the replacement of humans by machines to avoid all mistakes. Administrative logic's aim must be total computerization and so totally centralized control. On the other hand, the consumer is led to demand complete freedom of choice in purchase, and so competition in suppliers, who will only be rewarded on the basis of real sales with the real cost input. In other words, the consumer is led to the market. The Soviet regime is actually forced by the nature of its product to vacillate between the market and total centralized control. The Soviet regime stresses one or the other or both, depending on the nature of the particular crisis. The defective nature of the Soviet product is both a cause and a result of the system of production in the USSR. The defective nature of the Soviet product results in the formation of an enormous spare parts sector and a hypertrophied construction sector developed to supply parts that have failed in one form or another, or to complete construction projects that seem never to reach their natural conclusion. Additionally, more raw materials are required both to supply the expanding industry as well as to supply the defective goods that unnecessarily guzzle inputs. The vicious circle is developed further with the need to have an ever-expanding producer goods industry, as the defective producer goods absorb ever more resources, most particularly in the spare parts and construction industries. As a result, the consumer goods sector is starved of those resources. The worker receives a below subsistence wage and has even less reason to work to capacity, and every reason to permit the overabsorption of raw materials and to produce shoddy goods. The bureaucratic apparatus is then expanded to control all these features, which is in turn a further drain on resources. Hence, the state has to step in to control the massive discontent simmering below the surface. The worker has to be atomized. An enormous and incredibly wasteful apparatus of force is set up to maintain control. All of these qualities of the Soviet product lead, therefore, to two immediate consequences: a massive waste of resources and an immense shortage of goods. There is a third consequence that follows from these results. There is a limit to the quantity of goods that can be spent on the resource-absorbing sectors without causing overall breakdown, and, as a result, a halt has to be called to growth at specific points in time. In other words, a cycle develops that is not spontaneous, in that the Politburo has to intercede. Yet the reason why they step in, the hypertrophy of the construction sector, and disproportionate absorption of resources by Department 1 is beyond their control. There is also a long-term result. As long as labor can be absorbed from agriculture, the home, and other countries, the expansion of the absolute surplus masks the potential real rise in costs. Obviously, if enterprises keep needing more raw materials, more spare parts, and more replacement machinery, costs will tend to rise, all other things remaining the same. However, as long as labor can be used for repairs or as the alternative to machinery or spare parts, costs need not rise. Furthermore, new techniques can help to alleviate the rise in costs as long as new plants can be constructed with cheap labor. New section: the underlying reasons for the crisis. What is it that changed in the USSR? 4 things have altered in the past 2 decades. The fundamental aspect of change, underlying the other forms, is that the growth of the absolute surplus has come to an end because the workforce can no longer be replenished from the farms, the home, or elsewhere. Thus, the natural increase in the workforce was only 600,000 from 1985 to 1986 on the basis of 130.9 million employed in 1986. On the other hand, there was an increase from 106.8 million in 1970 to 125.6 million in 1980. In other words, the employed population increased by 17.6% over the 10-year period to 1980, but only 0.4% from 1985 to 1986. Over the 5-year period, 1980 to 1985, the relevant figure is 3.7%. Footnote. Something in Russian. End footnote. It is noteworthy that in 1988, the employed workforce actually declined by 1%. The agricultural population declined from 39% of the workforce in 1960 to 19% in 1986, but hardly changed from 1980 when it was 20% of the workforce. As regards women, they constituted 51% of the workforce from 1970 to 1986. However, they are today only 43% of the kolkhoz workers engaged in the kolkhoz itself, as opposed to 50% in 1970. This means that it is not possible to continue the rapid building of new factories, since there is not the labor to do it. That leads then to a decline in the introduction of new technique, since it is through new plants that new technology has historically been introduced. This has the effect of the factory using out-of-date equipment, which is more labor-intensive and of lower quality than its possible replacement. As a result, such factories tend to produce goods that are less reliable and less durable. As a consequence, there is increased pressure on the repair and spare parts sector. This sector had already grown to giant proportions, given the nature of the USSR, but it has had even greater burdens placed on it. The increased demands of the Soviet economy have placed an intolerable burden on the raw material sector. Thus, the USSR now produces 1.61 million tons of steel and 617. I don't know why I said that. Thus, the USSR now produces 161 million tons of steel and 617 million tons of oil, not to speak of 744 million tons of coal and 712,000 million cubic meters of gas. Footnote. There's no footnote. These are enormous figures, outdistancing the United States. They are indeed curious in that the United States produces much more consumer goods than the USSR. For instance, the USSR produces only 1.3 million cars as opposed to the 10 million or so made in the United States. Even though the United States now produces only half as much steel as the USSR. Again, U.S. oil consumption is not very different from that of the USSR, even though the USSR does not need gasoline on the same vast scale. Thus, the USSR produces an increasing quantity of both raw materials and processed raw materials such as fibers, but the demands of its industry are insatiable. This would not be a problem if both labor and resources were infinite, but since they are not, and more importantly, the USSR cannot innovate to the degree required, it is a necessary result that the raw materials sector acts as a constraint on growth. It has to be emphasized that the constraint is not of the kind spoken of by the regime itself. Taking the words from Orthodox Soviet studies experts in the West, of an extensive growth necessarily reaching its logical end. The absorption of raw materials occurs because of the deficiencies of the Soviet system. It requires, as indicated above, more raw materials for the same job than under capitalism. Furthermore, the level of demand for such raw materials seems to be growing faster with the expansion in the economy, reflecting the increasing disproportions throughout the economy. Thus, the failure to place new processes in old plants means that more cement, bricks, glass, and artificial fibers are required for construction purposes. The use of old equipment and processes itself means that more raw materials are needed, both because of the faulty nature of the machine and because of the outdated nature of the technique. For instance, today steel has been replaced by plastics which do not rust. When machines malfunction, the steel may be rendered faulty or the part imperfect, and more steel is needed. With plastics, on the other hand, the processes are simpler. When the machine malfunctions, it is easier to produce a new molding for the purpose required than to go through all the processes essential to produce the correct kind of steel and weld it together. The effect is that more raw material is needed, both because the steel gets used up more quickly and because it is inherently less suited to the product. The point, however, is that the USSR's demands for raw materials would be a fraction of what they are if the system functioned efficiently. Footnote. Some article from Russia in 1988. It says, the authors point out that capital expenditures per unit of extracted raw material has gone up from 1 unit 15 years ago to 4 today. End footnote. Obviously, if fewer products were needed, less raw material would be required. Improved quality, a reduced spare parts sector, and a diminished construction sector would greatly assist in alleviating demands for raw materials and improve the environment as well. Labor cannot substitute for raw materials, but correct usage of labor would mean less demand for raw materials, whereas increasing antagonism, or what has been called lack of discipline, has meant increasing inefficiency. The rise in cost of raw materials following on exhaustion of traditional supplies may have been inevitable, but it is very much more than it needed to be. Hence, it is not this problem in the supply of raw materials that is the constraint. Rather, it is the nature of the social relations in production. To make the point still clearer, it has been the case historically that raw material problems were met with substitution either of the raw material by an artificial source or of a new technique. These methods are greatly reduced in scope because of the difficulty in introducing new techniques. The construction sector, in turn, is under greater pressure to remedy the situation, but given the shortages, it becomes more and more difficult to complete projects. By 1980, Soviet economists congratulated themselves on having reached a point where the USSR no longer was spending all its resources in the construction sector on completing projects already begun. In fact, in 1980, 87% of capital investment was going into uncompleted projects, but this had declined to 79% in 1986. Nonetheless, Gorbachev was complaining in 1989 of the usual failure to complete projects. It should be noted that the figures mask a vast difference between light industry, where the figure for 1986 is just 64%, as compared with a startling of 142% for electricity generation or 133% for the chemical industry. The question of the decline in growth rates is reasonably openly discussed in the economic literature today. Thus, Sorokin speaks of a decline in return to funds invested of some 75%, growth of amount of goods remaining in circulation of 15%, and 15% growth of incomplete projects over the Brezhnev period. Over the same period, 1965 to 1984, the coefficient of utilization of machinery declined by 13%, while the rate of return to that machinery declined by 34%. Footnote: the return per ruble invested has gone down to 69 in 1986, using an index of 1,970 equal to 100, i.e. there has been an overall... Oh, shit. No, I'm saying it right. The return per ruble invested has gone down to 69 in 1986, using an index of 1970 equal to 100. There has been an overall decline of 31%, but on a steady annual basis. End footnote. The figures also show a considerable and important difference between light industry and engineering. In the period of 1980 to 86, there is a rise in the ratio of fixed capital invested to output of 23% for light industry and 13% for heavy industry. The engineering ratio of output to funds invested only declined by 8% from 1970 to 1986, whereas light industry declined by 45%. To add to the causes of declining returns, he points to low quality and the use of old technique. At the 27th Party Congress, Gorbachev gave a precise example of a factory that, upon completion, proceeded to produce outdated machinery. Little of this is news. Ever more production at greater cost of technically outdated goods that are of low quality, but that everyone has to use because there is no alternative, is of the essence of the Soviet economy. What is different is the spiraling decline. How can this be explained? The absurd statement that state capitalism requires the accumulation of capital explains little, particularly as really existing capitalism does not have such absurd ratios. Capitalism is simply nowhere near as inefficient. That is the real point. The whole stress of Gorbachev and his coterie is correctly placed on inefficiency as the cause of the economic problems of the USSR. We have already identified the problem of the introduction of new techniques. The problem associated with the question of technique and the nature of Soviet investment are considerable. One Soviet commentator, Pervushin, saw the USSR as suffering not from overaccumulation, but from a surfeit of fixed and circulating funds. He argues that the machinery introduced may be inferior to the old machinery, and the total effect of the introduction of the new technique is not necessarily positive in economic terms, even if the machinery is superior to that which it replaces. The point then is that even if new technique could be introduced quickly and efficiently, which it cannot, and the end result is dubious, Pervushin actually states that the introduction of new technique can cause a decline in productivity and make things worse, not better. The second cause lies in the vast overmanning of the system. This has already been discussed above, but it warrants a separate section. Figures of 15 to 20% dismissals required are bandied about today. This will lead to some 20 million layoffs. The question is not just the factor of overmanning, but its worsening over time. Why are plants more overmanned than before? The higher education of the personnel means that more people are employed in executive grades than before. More people, some 1.5 million, are involved in research than ever before. The bureaucratic apparatus has become bloated. This is why Gorbachev could speak of reducing the 18 million in the apparatus. In fact, this is a response to two pressures: the need to employ the intelligentsia and the need to control increasingly fractious workers. If production is poor, the answer has been to set up another body to oversee quality control or norms. Hence, bureaucratic employment increases. Here there is a contradiction between the short-term interests of the state and the long-term interests of the ruling group. In the second place, it pays every plant manager to retain workers, particularly under conditions of labor shortage, in order to use them when needed rather than to have to find them later. The change has been that the increasing labor shortage has increased the need for hoarding of workers from the point of view of each plant, but not from the viewpoint of the society. What is also different is the extensive discussion of the details of the economic failure. Thus, when we are told that only 18 out of 45 kinds of goods in the RSFSR, light industry, had their plans fulfilled in 1985, and other examples are given in the same issue of Ekonomiskaya Gazeta, of plans nominally fulfilled, which involved a considerable decline in production, the very heart of the matter is being touched. The so-called planning mechanism does not work. Some plans are considerably overfulfilled, while for others the reverse is true, but nominally the total results show ever-improving production. Since this same problem has been true ever since the first Stalin plan, although never discussed so frankly, the inevitable conclusion is that the system does not work. Such is the intended implication wrapped up in the ideology of changes needed because of a shift into intensive production. These are issues I have discussed extensively elsewhere. Footnote: see Ticktin, Towards a Political Economy of the USSR, published in Critique 1, 1973. The Contradictions of Soviet Society and Professor Bettelheim, 1976. The Afghan War and the Crisis in the USSR, Critique 12. And The Ambiguities of Ernest Mandel, Critique 12. End footnote. What is different now is that Gorbachev put this issue at the center of his program, as evidenced early on by his speech of the 11th of June 1985 and by the preliminary outline of the new 12th five-year plan, where the new investment was now to go only half instead of three-quarters into new plants. We will return to this point below. The Congress speeches are just put the seal of approval on the already agreed view. There is another reason for the failure to complete projects. Under Khrushchev, a moratorium was declared on the construction of new buildings, but this was not repeated after Khrushchev's fall because of the consequence: massive unemployment. It could not be repeated also because there were fewer new projects. In other words, the slowdown of the system created its own momentum. It was socially increasingly risky to take decisive measures, and it was more difficult to take a risk because there was less and less leeway. Behind this problem lay two fundamental changes in Soviet society. These were the increased socialization of labor and the consequent growth in power of the Soviet workforce. Both are also closely related to the decline in the supply of labor outside of the industrial economy. The second feature that has changed and led to the Soviet crisis is that the increasingly urbanized economy, based on manufacturing production and not on advertising, finance, corner shops, retailing, and other forms of absorption of labor in the West, is far more integrated than it has ever been. The paradox is that it is an economy with giant plants, trusts, and quote central planning that cannot supply or repair itself with any regularity, so that its potential virtue is in fact its Achilles heel. Today, the ramifications of failure to deliver on time, construct to specification, or repair as requested are much greater than ever before. The costs are multiples of what they were 20 and more years ago. The effect is to magnify the failure of the Soviet economy. The integration of the economy is ultimately reducible to the integration of the division of labor within the USSR. This in turn is composed of two elements. One, the greater specificity of labor in two senses: attachment to locality (factory, home, town), and the particular development of skills. And two, a tightly organized production process. The latter cannot be altered without reducing productivity, an evident result in the USSR, while the former, Braverman notwithstanding, cannot be overcome without massive costs. Labor that has been trained can, in principle, be retrained quickly if there is a reasonable incentive to retrain. Where there is little incentive, it will not happen without considerable disruption. We have argued many times that the basis of the political economy of the USSR rests on the absence of abstract labor in the country, and in this context it implies the lack of fluidity of labor inherent in a system with a labor shortage, and a highly specific relation to the production unit. The third aspect of the crisis is associated with the increasing distance between the West and the USSR in the level of technology employed in production. We have already discussed the question of the introduction of new technology and will discuss it again below. Here we outline the increasing intensity of the problem feeding into the Soviet crisis. The problems with labor have led to the forced introduction of new techniques and particularly technology imported from abroad. In the context of the USSR, it is to be noted that new technology actually raises costs rather than the reverse. This is because in the USSR, new technology leads to the use of new fuel, or more fuel in many instances, higher maintenance costs, even if less time is spent, it usually requires more skill, a higher depreciation cost, more breakdowns in the initial learning and development stages, and more auxiliary costs. None of these problems is specifically Soviet. What is Soviet is that they are all exacerbated to a considerable degree, and above all not compensated by a reduction in the workforce, higher output, and the greater reliability and precision of the new machines. Obviously, if a new machine is introduced, it might be expected that it would cost more, but the cost is usually offset by the higher throughput of goods. I don't know what throughput means. I have an idea. I can feel like it's like one of those words when you hear it and you don't know what it means, but you're like, I kind of feel like I understand the gist. If the norm is controlled by the workers and the workers do not permit such a higher output, or if workers do permit a higher output, but it is so far below potential that per unit costs rise, then the introduction of the new machine actually raises costs rather than reducing costs. Since the new machine is not reliable, but it performs more tasks formerly performed by manual labor, it will cause more holdups in production than before. Furthermore, it will cause the continued hypertrophy of the repair sector, which in turn will require still more labor and more spare parts. Unless the auxiliary aspects are mechanized, the demand for labor actually increases. The storage and portage facilities can be handled through production lines or by the use of manual labor. By and large, the USSR continues to use unskilled female labor for these tasks. Since the production of new products, new spare parts, and new processes requires warehousing, both construction and labor demand rises. The need for transport facilities inside and between plants continues to expand. The problem for the USSR is that such transport facilities are often custom made, and it is not easy to obtain such facilities in the USSR. The end result, therefore, of the importation of new technique from abroad has been predictable. It has led to demands for the introduction of a system that can cope with the new technology. Much of the machinery imported from the West lay idle in the 1970s. At the same time, the need for new technology, computers in particular, became overwhelming during the 1980s. It was not just a question of competing with the West. Soviet production had reached the point where computerization was demanded by the logic of production itself. Yet the failure to produce computers became a feature of the regime. Footnote: Stepan Pachakov, Computing in the Cold, Personal Computer, 1989. This account of the Soviet computer industry smuggled out of the USSR makes hilarious reading and is an excellent introduction to the failure of Soviet industry. The second-hand price of an ordinary PC in the USSR is many times the cost of a car. The author attributes the failure of the computer industry to ideology and the long lead times taken to make decisions by the numerous layers of the industrial apparatus. Quote, throughout the economy, it takes so much decision-making, coordination, and adjustment to implement a new product that it becomes obsolete before it gets onto the production line. End quote. End footnote. In fact, the problem with technology was itself a result of the previous two aspects. The ending of the labor surplus meant that new enterprises could no longer be built in order to incorporate new technology in the old way, and the integrated nature of production demanded a much better form of technological coordination, which itself needs computerization at all levels of production. Finally, as a direct consequence of the previous points, the strength of the workforce could only grow, as it has grown, to the point where the elite are afraid of it and make concessions. That time is now. The elite know that they cannot introduce the market without a revolt. The elite cannot introduce a reserve army of labor. And the elite have to accept continual growth in nominal wages. The effect is to make the elite cautious of any change, since anything that would reduce the degree of atomization in the system would make the situation very unstable. The increasing power and negative action of the workers has shown itself in 5 aspects. First, blue-collar wages in industry have been rising steadily over the years, from 66.1 rubles per month in 1950 to 88 to 90 rubles in 1960, to 216.4 rubles in 1986, and 235 rubles in 1988, making an annual percentage growth rate of 2.4 from 1960 to 1986, while the salaries of the engineering and technical personnel, intelligentsia, have gone up at much slower rates, by 1.76%, from 135.7 rubles per month in 1960 to 239 rubles in 1986. Footnote: the later statistical volumes do not provide details of the pay of the engineering and technical workers, here called the intelligentsia. End footnote. Second, The control over norms becomes more weighed in favor of workers in that period. The degree of overfulfillment increased at the same time that the norms in fact eased in relation to potential. Footnote. Henri Marr. The common overfulfillment of plans by workers, which Remar discusses, follows on the tightening up procedure of the late 1950s. In other words, control cannot be exercised from the center over the workers. End footnote. Third, alcoholism has increased. Footnote. Between 1970 and 1980, the amount of alcohol sold went up to close to 33% per capita. Thereafter, the campaigns to reduce production meant that the amount sold was under half of that of 1980. Illegal production is another matter. End footnote. Alcoholism is a response to stress more than anything else. For the USSR, alcoholism has played a special role in quenching potential revolt through a solitary solution made easier by the individual relation to the work process. Footnote. I am indebted to this insight by Mr. P. O'Donnell of the Department of Psychology, Glasgow University. End footnote. It is particularly the atomized form that demands that the worker find an individualized, separated relief. In the last period, the stress had become greater than previously, leading workers to pay less attention to their work and more attention to their psychological requirements. Fourth, the nature of performance in the labor process is deteriorated, evidenced by the poor quality of work, even when it appears that the goods are hardly touched by the human hands. End footnote. Footnote. An article from Pravda on the 26th of November 1987 makes it clear that quality fell before Gorbachev. After writing that defective goods were not held back and culprits punished, as previously in the particular plant, it says that as a result, quote, quality began to fall. Defective goods were put to the account of the plant, end quote. Parenthesis, and hence by implication not laid at the door of any individual or group of individuals, end parenthesis. There is some evidence in the statistics of surveys done of articles of light industry. End footnote. Fifth, the number of strikes is increasing and the effect of the strikes has become more dramatic. In particular, the strikes in the mines and the national republics and elsewhere showed themselves in terms of the plain results of 1989 and for the first quarter of 1990. Footnote. Pravda, 28th of January 1990, and Financial Times, 9th of April 1990, which summarizes the Soviet reports for the first quarter of 1990. End footnote. Clearly, the increased power of the workers has increased costs, and the number of bureaucrats required to control such costs. To this has to be added the additional costs of campaigns, and indeed of the dismissal of supervisors to be replaced by trainees. New section. The problem of technology in historical perspective. It is important to consider further the problems of the introduction of new technology. It is clear that a rise in labor productivity over time would alleviate the problems of the Soviet economy. Yet, on the contrary, it has become progressively harder to introduce new techniques. If we consider the problem in the introduction of new technology, they are reduced to two issues. The technology produced in the USSR may itself be defective. As a result, the costs of introduction are unacceptably high. On the other hand, even a non-defective technology may not be acceptable to the plant because the existing production relations are threatened. Hence, the introduction of new technology goes back to the same issue as in the case of any product. Labor controls the work process and hence produces a good or process of its own kind and prevents the disruption of its time-honored pattern of production. It has, therefore, to be noted that the nature of Soviet technique is thus a reflection of the nature of the Soviet product. The origins of the Soviet product itself lie in the original conflict within the goals of the regime. On the other hand, on the one hand, in 1929, the aim of collectivization and industrialization was to raise the relative surplus, that is, to increase the surplus product over consumption by reducing the amount of labor time required to produce goods. On the other hand, it was only the rise in the absolute surplus that permitted growth in the relative surplus, and so a rise in productivity. The point will be explained below. The Soviet elite were faced in the late 1920s with the problem of how to raise the necessary surplus over consumption to ensure sustained, quote, accumulation. There were necessarily two components of this issue. The first was how to obtain the initial surplus. The second was how to sustain the reinvestment of that surplus in the new technology required. They acquired the surplus product through squeezing the standard of living of the direct producers, peasants and workers, and obtained the necessary labor through the flood into the towns induced by the starvation in the countryside. This process, analogous to primitive accumulation, raised the absolute surplus product. In other words, the surplus was raised through the extension of labor time or the reduction of the standard of living. On the other hand, the process was intended to raise the surplus product by raising the standard of living and either keeping work time constant or reducing work time. This could only be achieved through raising productivity through the application of the new machinery and hence new technology, which is being produced with the acquired surplus. As indicated above, the regime has always had considerable trouble with the introduction of the new technique. In the 1930s, the new technology was certainly introduced, but only through the process of raising the absolute surplus, that is, using vast quantities of extra labor. That was the weakness of the regime. Its paradox was that, in order to raise the relative surplus, the absolute surplus had to be increased. In other words, the regime has always had to increase the number of workers employed in order to introduce new technology and so raise productivity. The apparent success of the regime was achieved through an interpenetration of the two above forms of surplus. The workers resisted the introduction of forms of extraction of the relative surplus as a method of reducing the extraction of the absolute surplus. They worked poorly or took action to contain the effects of the introduction of new technology. The result was overmanning, technology that was outdated even when introduced, high cost of installation, and little savings from the introduction of the new machinery. On the other hand, had the new machinery not been installed, nothing would have been produced. The growth in absolute surplus then masked the failure to raise the relative surplus by itself or even in itself for considerable periods of time. More concretely, the use of alienated labor to produce machine tools meant that the machine tools were outdated, unreliable, very costly, and of the wrong kind for the job. As a result, the savings anticipated from the use of the new tool were not realized, but the product itself might not have existed apart from the machine tool. Furthermore, there was initially at least a rise in the relative surplus product as a result of the employment of the machine tool. Problems arose when it was a question of replacement of one tool by another. Then savings became more problematic, with a possible increase in labor costs, increase in raw material costs, increased risk of breakdown, and so on, as long as these costs there could be contained through the employment of more labor to construct new factories that would not have the usual obstacles, or more labor to make more spare parts or more processed raw materials. The question of cost was secondary. There are two aspects of the extraction of the absolute surplus: the extension of labor time and the reduction of the wage. The reduction of the standard of living, or at least its containment, also permitted a considerable expansion of producer goods, but it was bound to end with the increasing socialization of production and consequent increased power of the workforce, there was also a limit to the exploitation of the countryside. Once these three aspects came together, the real increase in the relative surplus was clear. Put differently, the real increase in productivity was shown to be low. At this point, it is necessary to be careful, since productivity here must refer to productivity for the purpose of raising the surplus product. In the USSR, it is quite possible ostensibly to increase production but to have no effect on the surplus product. The product may be useless or the product or be a worse replacement for another product. Under capitalism, a useless product may create surplus value, but in the USSR, the surplus product is in the form of use values. Hence, it is quite possible to have a formally large surplus product that is nonetheless incapable of being used for reproduction and therefore is not genuinely part of the surplus product. It is potentially possible, therefore, for a formal improvement in technique to lead to a decrease in the surplus product. As long as the expansion of the absolute surplus continued, the dubiety, I don't know if that means like dubiousness. The dubiety of the increase in the relative surplus was masked. Let's look this word up. The dubiety. Dubiety. I think it's actually how you say it. I'll repeat the sentence. As long as the expansion of the absolute surplus continued, the dubiety of the increase in the relative surplus was masked. Its ending has begun to show the problems. The primary problem is one of ending the control over the work process established by the worker during the 1930s. The method of extraction of the surplus product during this period, which was one of virtually pure coercion, established the nature of the relative surplus product. This is the real point. In effect, the stability of the regime, to the extent that it can be called stable, was established through this marriage of relative and absolute surplus labor. The different problems in the introduction of new technology are all traceable to this synthesis. Because the worker defended himself against further incursions on his necessary labor time by individually establishing control over his work process. He resisted any change that might alter the particular relation in the factory. Indeed, the factory manager colluded, since it was not in his interest to engage in a long drawn-out battle that might only benefit his successor, and anyway might never show up as increased production. Hence, new technology had to be tried and tested in newly constructed factories. It had to be specially adapted for poor handling, and a considerable amount of labor time had to be allocated to deal with the problems that would necessarily arise. It can be seen that new technology was introduced and the relative surplus was raised, but only as long as the absolute surplus product was also increasing. Once that situation ended, the regime faced a crisis. In principle, the regime can solve its crisis by reducing the most blatant examples of overmanning. This, however, would only be a temporary solution, even if it were politically possible. The extra labor would be quickly used up. Furthermore, as long as that labor is contained under a regime of terror, as under Stalin, labor remains cheap. Indeed, the view that labor is cheap in the USSR has become the dominant viewpoint among Soviet economists. Footnote. See Gordon something in Russian. End footnote. Cheapness under conditions where money is not money cannot just mean that the total ruble costs are low. It really means that it is easier to employ workers than to use machines, and that fewer resources need to be devoted to consumer goods, welfare, education, and the factory environment.
Both factory managers and, quote, planners prefer to employ more workers rather than design an automated plant to replace existing plants. Once, however, the source of labor dries up, then the economy has even greater difficulty introducing new technology, and it therefore has a low growth rate. New section: the contradiction between Departments 1 and 2. Gorbachev quickly moved to improve the production of machinery in terms of total output, level of technology, and quality. The measures have had little result. Footnote: see Matisik and B. Matisik, A. Matisik and B. Matisik in Soviet Economy, Volume 4, Number 2, 1988. End footnote. The situation was better than previously, but nowhere near the stated or necessary goals. While the regime has consistently overproduced Department 1 goods, as described above, the producer goods remain antiquated, with average ages going back 20 to 30 years. In the post-Khrushchev period, economists complained that machine tools could be found that went back to the turn of the century. Even the defense industry discovered that it was inexorably being left behind by the West. The paradox of a regime that invests too much in producer goods, yet produces neither sufficient machines nor machines of the right quality and technical standard, must be explained. The absorption of resources in the construction sector, spare parts sector, replacement sector, among others, is enormous. The producer goods sector can expand indefinitely through the need to expand production, introduce new technology, etc., but costs at the present time have simply escalated. The result is that resources are absorbed in additional output, whether real or not, and the whole forms of production remain at their old levels of productivity. The new technology from the West has remained underutilized, and increasingly new technology is simply not introduced at all. The old plant absorbs more and more resources as it ages, while the cost of introducing new techniques also rise. Footnote: the radical reform economist V. Zelyunin. Let's see if there's anything for this. Not seeing anything. Back to the text. The radical reform economist V. Zelyunin calculated that the real relation of producer goods to consumer goods was of the order of 40% to 60% of the total goods produced, as opposed to official figures nearer to 25% and 75%. He simply took account of the arbitrary prices and taxes involved and produced an adjustment. The effect, as he points out, is to give the USSR a saving rate of 40% of production, which is very high compared to the West. The Soviet economy is far ahead of any other country in the production of metal, fuel, machine tools, tractors, etc. He concludes that, quote, the economy is working more and more for itself and not for man, end quote. The crucial point here is the implicit acceptance of the view that it is the economy that operates in this way, and not the directions of the elite. The economy malfunctions. To ram his point home, the author points to the larger amount of unused equipment. 45% of workplaces in engineering have no one to work them, and 1/4 in industry as a whole. See Zelyunin's article in Sotsialistiskaya Industria, 5th of January 1988. End footnote. It is clear that the theorists who argue that the regime just ignores the consumer are themselves ignoring reality. The fact is that the regime cannot produce goods as required. Resources are absorbed by two features. First, the old plant needs replacement, and also spare parts.
on a daily basis. Second, the new technology goes into new enterprises, plants, and factories, and so absorbs still more resources through construction needs. Department 1 has grown, so has the need for spare parts and replacements, as well as the demand for new technology to replace the old. The trouble is that the new technology does not go into the old plants, since there is a shortage of machine tools and Department 1 goods in general. It follows that the old sector always has a demand for its goods. It is therefore a law of the Soviet economy that the primacy of Department 1 over Department 2 is correlated with an increasing demand for Department 1 goods. The faster Department 1 grows, the greater paradoxically is the demand for Department 1 goods. Department 1 has to supply machinery not only to itself, but also to Department 2. The demand for Department 2 is really limited only by the supply of goods from Department 1. It would, of course, be constrained by the supply of raw materials or labor if it had a considerable expansion of machinery. But the latter is not the fundamental constraint. The demand for Department 1 itself, from Department 1 itself, is also apparently unlimited. Its expansion requires apparently unlimited inputs for the reasons given above. If, therefore, Department 1 is given primacy, as Department 1 has been since 1929, it will grow explosively and in a manner that not only sucks in ever more resources, but also maintains its own backwardness. It has also been pointed out above that increased investment can actually lead to a decline in output. Under these circumstances, Department 1's expansion can be seen as a paradox of the regime, in which it is driven to expand Department 1 in order to increase the output of consumer goods, but is simply never able to reach its goal. No one gains through increased investment in an enterprise that simply leads to a decline in output or to a rise in costs with no increase in output. It cannot be attributed to bureaucratic inertia or simply for the heavy goods sector. If, on the contrary, as in 1988 under Gorbachev, consumer goods production is given preference, then the lack of machinery in Department 2 will eventually show itself, and the system will demand increased inputs for Department 1. The Gorbachev gamble is that the workers will be encouraged to work harder under conditions where extra money for promotion or bonuses will mean real goods. The problem is exemplified most graphically in the case of cars, where the annual production of more than a few 100,000 cars for general distribution to a population rapidly approaching 300 million requires massive retooling. Even if private cars were rejected as a mode of transport, the public transport system is overloaded and requires enormous investment. The supply of everyday consumer durables, from automatic washing machines to video recorders, is woefully inadequate. Their production can only be marginally expanded by the present decrees, requiring every plant to supply consumer goods. Such central demands are reminiscent of the, quote, small is good, Maoist line, with all it implied. What the hell does that mean? I'm not saying anything for small is good Maoism. Anyway, back to the text. Under Brezhnev, there was only 1 year when Department 1 was overtaken by Department 2. But that was all it was. There is no way out of this vicious circle within the confines of the so-called administrative command economy. It is precisely because of the blood-sucking nature of the means of production department that the social services such as education, housing, health, and welfare have had to be starved, and yet it is all quite rational. Department 1, the means of production department, I don't know if I said that. I mean, it's implied by what's being said, but Department 1 is the means of production department,
Department 2 is the means of consumption department. And it's a reference to Capital Volume 2, the last part of Capital Volume 2, which kind of talks about the preconditions for would be necessary for balanced growth in a capitalist economy. Not saying that there is balanced growth, but what would be necessary, what would be the necessary ratios of means of production department to the means of consumption department for a balanced capitalist development. It's not saying that it is balanced. It's just saying, what if? Anyway. And yet it is all quite rational. Department 1 cannot supply the goods unless Department 1 has the necessary resources. The trouble is that the so-called capital output ratio has been worsening. In other words, the absorption of resources per unit of output by Department 1 has been rising. As already discussed, the reason for the worsening ratios of unit of investment to unit of output lies in the increasing socialization of labor and the ending of the period of excess labor. As long as labor could take up the slack when a particular tool failed to perform as required, the costs were relatively low. Once the labor was no longer there, costs escalated. This has been exacerbated by the increasing integration of production, which now magnifies the effects of unevenness of production and the failure of machinery. Then, too, costs of labor have increased considerably with the increasing power of the workforce. This involves not only higher pay, but also decreasing flexibility of the workforce in relation to the labor process. New section: the increasing power of labor and its effects. The Soviet worker has been moving from a position of total defeat to a position of increasing strength, which has a series of ramifications throughout the economy. Wages have to rise, as wages have done since the 1960s. Consumption demands become ever more pressing as a result. Resources are switched to the consumer goods sector, and as a result, the producer goods sector deteriorates, immediately affecting the consumer goods sector. New technology becomes more difficult to introduce into old plants, as the norm bargain struck with management is difficult to change. Workers work to rule. In turn, the deteriorating economy leads management to pressurize workers, who then become more stressed. They may turn to alcohol or other forms of individualization, which reacts still more unfavorably on the nature of the product. For a time, the product can even deteriorate still further, but a halt has to be called to the falling levels of quality control, just as to maintain production. When labor can no longer be used to replace or supplement defective parts, exhausted machinery, or indeed machinery as such, Department 1 has to be further expanded, and this absorbs still more resources. Factories have to invest in more equipment, spare parts, and new extensions. Capital expenditure, so-called, rises. The constant refrain that the USSR uses too much manual labor, particularly in things like porterage, has been heard for the last decade. What the hell is porterage? Is it like as in like a person who like checks people into like hotels and shit? Okay. No, it's not what it means. Porterage means the work of carrying supplies, goods, etc., done by porters. Oh, no, it's like the carrying of luggage and supplies. See, that's what I was thinking of it, because there's a film called The Night Porter about this like Nazi who lives a life after the Third Reich as a porter in London, I believe. Maybe France. I think in London. It's a very good movie, The Night Porter. That's why I was thinking it was specifically a hotel person. But anyway, I guess it's like a hotel person that carries your bags for you. The constant refrain from the USSR uses too much manual. The constant refrain that the USSR uses too much manual labor, particularly in things like porterage, has been heard for the last decade. Footnote: some article in Russian by Sonin, M. Sonin, March 1977.
An intolerable conflict is established between the means of production and the means of consumption department, in which the means of consumption department has to expand to deal with the increasing power of the workers, but cannot expand without the infinite expansion of the means of production department. The dog wants to catch its tail, but the only way to catch its tail is to run around, so it runs around never catching its tail. In capitalism, one or the other sector would be subordinated through the movement of value, most particularly in extremes through crisis. In the USSR, it cannot be done. The elite possesses no mechanism to subject the economy fully to their own control. The elite can only manage the economy, administer the economy, and fail to administer the economy as the economy goes into insoluble conflicts. The economy then finds itself rent in an even more extreme way than has been the case since 1923, between consumption and production, between demand and supply, between machinery and labor, between the quantity of, quote, money and the amount of resources available, between new plants and old plants, between the need to improve quality and the need to maintain quantity. Every problem becomes insoluble. The economy progressively falls apart. Dissolution sets in. Hence, Gorbachev and his men are the saviors of a disintegrating economy. No solution can work except the introduction of the market. Yet the very reason for the introduction of the market is the reason why the market cannot be introduced: the strength of labor. Thus, the regime has to find temporary solutions for each problem in turn. The regime has used centralized interference as its prime method of restoring balance in the economy. Under Stalin, the purges played a crucial role, while under his successors it was organization and reorganization. Gorbachev is in the same tradition. Gorbachev has in fact continued to centralize, yet the centralization inevitably fails to do more than hold the system together. Since the center cannot actually hold all the required information or levers in the center's own hands, the more centralized the system is, the more independent the peripheral areas become. This is a paradoxical law of the system. A vicious circle sets in. The independence of the periphery has to be curbed, and more centralized control established. But the center becomes so bureaucratically overburdened that the center progressively loses more control over the units over which it is in charge. This is what led to Gorbachev's original cry that the system required both more centralization and more decentralization. The problem is that the centralization/decentralization as it now exists is chaotic, with both insufficient real centralized coordination and insufficient real direct local initiative for the purposes of the economy. On the other hand, it is the only method of control that currently exists for purposes of organizing the system. In fact, all measures hitherto introduced amount to methods of facilitating this relationship. That has really been the message for the post-Stalin period. Already under Stalin and his notorious economic problems of socialism, the official doctrine had been changed to argue in favor of the market for consumer goods. Ever since, the regime has been discussing the implementation of some type of market reform. Since they have never done it, they have used the alternative of market surrogates, such as planning on the basis of amount realized rather than total quantity produced. These forms have all worked to a limited degree and then failed. The bureaucracy has reached its ultimate point when the bureaucracy can no longer organize, but only organize itself to organize. It has to reorganize itself constantly to secure the economy. Stalin, by contrast, liquidated the layers that are today being reorganized in order to establish direct control. Stalin failed, and Stalin's successors have tried to implement new forms of control over themselves. Stalin's successors have also replaced one group of administrators by another. The drastic step of killing all the administrators or replacing the administrators in a more humane manner is unlikely to achieve anything other than limited goals, and the regime has therefore been compelled to find ever new forms of reorganization. The bad workman always blames his tools, and the elite blames its organizational form rather than the reality of conflict with the direct producer.
None other than Joseph Stalin himself began the fashion of attacking bureaucracy in order to preserve the bureaucratic elite. Gorbachev's acceptance of this point marks a new stage in the Soviet crisis. Gorbachev proposed that the Soviets should manage the administration of the country, while political and ideological functions would remain with the party. This would appear to mean that the party economy would function independently of the party. The elite, however, are impaled on the horns of a dilemma. The elite can introduce genuine democracy and be voted out, so losing all, or the elite can create an imaginary democracy, which may buy the elite time, but will whet the appetite of the population for real democratic forms. The latter is the way that they are going. On the one hand, they are afraid to go too fast in case they lose all, and on the other hand, they have to install a temporary alternative that does indeed prolong their tenure as members of an elite. Until 1990 at least, they had succeeded in maintaining their own position while introducing a semi-democratic parliamentary institution with an executive president who had not run for popular election until 1995. The examples of Eastern Europe are only formally similar. They were always either occupied countries or very much dependent on the USSR. The elites in those countries were always disposable by their ultimate supporters in the USSR. The only question for the Soviet elite is whether it can maintain itself in power while converting to the market. That's the end of Chapter 8 of Hillel Ticktin's Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, Essays in the Political Economy of a Disintegrating System.